we're going to start with the select tool, and just going to demonstrate this by clicking on a shape, right, just right here. And if you want to go to the selection tool, the shortcut is actually V. Once it's enabled, it's going to show this sort of attributes. I'll be going through some of them, and apparently, for example, let me just maybe go through some of this. Let me just create a duplicate. I'm just going to press Ctrl or Command D and create a duplicate. I'm just going to push this right there, right? Apparently, there's a place where you can disable or enable the manipulator. So let me disable it and to show out something which is actually very fundamental. Apparently, there's a place where you can transform. If you are literally selecting multiple sort of objects, you can transform them as individuals, which makes sense in some places, and in other places it doesn't make much sense. So once I click on this, I can actually transform them as individuals. For example, the anchor point of this sort of these rectangles is actually within the center, so there will be scaling from the center. If I actually come to the anchor point tool, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, and just enable the anchor point to actually be I've just put the anchor point of this to be right here at the top, and select them again and transform them. You're going to see that this is transforming from where the anchor point is. The other one will be transforming from the center. That's actually very, very important to note. The other one is actually the grouping, so you can transform them as a group. So once I change them, it doesn't matter where the anchor point basically is, right? Different anchor points, and they're all transforming as a group. So that's the issues of this. Once we enable the manipulator, these are literally disabled, and it will show us this sort of a UI, which is more of the manipulator, I think. So yeah, that's basically it. The next one, actually, still going back to the select tool or something like that. Once you enable the select tool, you can actually move stuff around. It works like, how it works in After Effects and stuff like that. And you can also manipulate. For example, I'm having this sort of a shape. I can actually increase or decrease the sort of size, right, in here of this particular shape. Let me just enable it in here. As you can see, the size has been increasing or decreasing. Same thing actually, if we enable maybe the circle, we can manipulate the radius within the UI using the shape tool. Same thing with the rotation. I can actually just change the rotation of this sort of a shape, right, using this sort of a thing in here. As you can see, I can actually rotate it around, increase or decrease the radius, and different sort of a stuff using the user interface. So that's basically it to do with the select tool. The next one, I'm still going to enable the shape or something like that, pressing Alt and then clicking on any of these shapes. So this is basically the anchor point tool. I've already talked about it in the previous sort of a thing in there. I can just click anywhere and put the anchor point tool in there. I can also just drag it and put it anywhere I want. Let me say I just want it to be maybe somewhere here. Apparently in After Effects it's called the anchor point. Here it's actually called the pivot, right? So this is basically the pivot tool. The shortcut is Y, just like in After Effects. So anyway, I press it. That's where now the pivot point is basically the place where all the transformation basically take place. So once I rotate, it's going to actually rotate from having a reference from that sort of a place. That's where all the transformations are literally going to take place or something like that. Same thing with the scaling. It's going to select scale from that sort of a place, right? If I scale it down, as you can see, it's scaling from that place. So that's what the pivot tool basically does. It changes the pivot of the object. Now this is actually only available in Cavalry 26.2. It's not available in the previous versions, right? Although you could actually change it from this sort of a place within the attributes, as you can see. Just changing here, it basically shows us that the object is moving around, but the pivot point is actually the one which is changing. So I can just put it back within the sort of a center. Now this is a harder sort of a thing of doing it. I don't really recommend it, but I'm just showing you that you can actually change it, and apparently it's changing more or less from the center. So if I'm to scale this down, you see it's scaling from the center, which is actually very important. Yeah, the next one is actually the select tool, and I'm going to still press Alt and create another sort of a shape. I'm just going to give it a different color. Nice. And apparently the shape is not editable, right? It's a rectangle shape, it's not editable. Once I want to make it editable, I'm just going to press on this edit shape tool. The shortcut is actually A. If you've used Illustrator and still After Effects, it's actually the same sort of a thingy shortcut. Once I press A, still the element is not going to be editable, but once I click on any of these non-editable parts, right, once I click on them, right, it's going to bring this sort of a popover, and it's going to tell us that this shape is not editable. Would you like to make it editable? And you can just press yes, right? And apparently it's actually editable. So once I click on any of the parts, you know, I can actually move them around. And these parts are animatable. So once I click on animate path, it's just going to create keyframes, and I can just, you know, put them wherever I want, you know, create that sort of a tick and make it kind of small. Yeah, and they are basically animatable. So once I, you know, press space, you know, it creates a sort of animation. So yeah, they are animatable, so you can actually move stuff around, which is actually very, very nice. So let me delete that, and I'm just going to put another one in there. So there's also another way. There's a shortcut to this, to actually making the shape editable. You can press Ctrl E, right? Let me just maybe enable this sort of the selection tool. Once I press Ctrl E, as you can see, they're literally black. Once I press Ctrl E, it's going to make it editable. As you can see, it shows this sort of brackets, and it shows that it's editable. So I can still move it around and edit it the way I want to actually make it. There's another way of actually doing this using the shape tools. You can actually make it editable. There's another way of actually making an editable copy. So it basically duplicates the shape, and then it hides the one which is uneditable, and it reveals the one which is editable, which actually makes a lot of sense in some places. So yeah, that's basically it with this. There are also other sort of panels that you can actually explore in here. There are some booleans, which I'll talk about later in this video. So let me just delete this back to the selection tool. I'm just going to click delete. There's also a pen tool. This basically works more or less the same as how it works in Illustrator and After Effects. Once I click on it, except that, you know, it has a better sort of user experience, and, you know, it's visually smarter. Once I click on it, I can actually create different paths in here, which is actually very, very nice. I love how that basically looks. And this sort of a thing which shows some sort of a preview before you actually make that sort of a shape, right? There's also some other sort of controls in here. For example, once I click G, I can actually create a new contour with the same sort of a shape. As you can see, I'm now creating a new contour. If I literally click and then, you know, keep it clicked, I can actually create these sort of Bezier paths, which is actually very, very nice. And I can continue making that Bezier path, and then I can actually go back to, you know, creating these sort of lines. Once I press G, I can also create another sort of contour, which is very, very nice, but on the same sort of a shape, which is very, very nice. There's another way of actually creating a new contour on a different shape. You can press Escape and create a new shape, right? As you can see, it has created another shape. Once I press Escape again, I'm going to create another contour on a new shape, which is actually very, very nice. So yeah, I'm going to delete this, and going back, still, I'm going to create another one, and I just want to show some of the few things that you can actually do. Up here, we have the snap angle. I'm just going to keep it at 15 by default. Now here, you can actually change the stroke width. You can increase it. Now, the same sort of stroke width, you can actually increase it within the sort of stroke sort of thingies in here. It's actually the same sort of a thingy you can do using this sort of panel, right? But you'd rather maybe do it from here and not really have to make multiple clicks to actually change the width. Same thing with cap style. You can actually change it to a rounded, a flat, or a projecting, right? Some people are going to prefer making it rounded or something like that. Then there's this sort of a close distance. It's apparent at 40. You can also edit it from there. We also have different sort of thingies here. We can actually change the joint style. Apparently it was mid-trim, right? So you can change it to round, or you can actually change it to bevel mode, right? Depending on what you may prefer. And also these are other sort of things that you can actually change and animate in the stroke sort of path, which we shall not go into apparently because there are too many. Yeah, that's basically it with the pen tool. Other things which I'll be going through them in the next coming tutorials. Then we have something called the pencil tool, right? In Illustrator, it also exists. It behaves much like the brush tool or something like that. And it has different sort of, abilities in here. By default, once I click onto it, it's going to maintain the sort of stroke width, the one we used previously. Let me just decrease it. As you can see, it works more or less like a pencil, right? As you can see, let me maybe just enable the direct select tool or the edit path tool. You're going to see that it has multiple points. So let me just maybe remove these, right? There's some sort of attributes or maybe things that you can actually change in here that we're going to go through in a bit. First of all, I talked about the stroke width with the curve style. We talked about it in the pen tool. Now there's something which is new in here, which is accuracy. Now, if you enable the accuracy to be low, right, it will actually bring in this sort of jagged sort of thingies. Why? Because you've made the accuracy to be low. So it's going to be less accurate. The way if you actually, create this sort of a thing is using your hand and your hand is shaking, it's going to remove it. So it's going to keep those shakes. But if you change the accuracy from low to something like high, I'm just going to set it to high for you guys to see a contrast, right? And I click on the same sort of a thingy. It's going to make it more or less accurate, right? And let me just maybe click on the select path, right? As you're going to see, this has more points than this, right? Because the accuracy is set to actually high. Let me go back to the path. There's something called a stabilizer, right? Once you enable stabilizer, it's going to actually make the path look way more smoother, right? So if I create the same sort of a path with the stabilizer, as you can see, okay, let me just maybe delete this, right? Let me create a path without a stabilizer, but the accuracy is a bit high. And then let me enable the stabilizer and create the same sort of a path. It's going to create something which is actually more accurate because, it's actually stabilizing them and it shows that sort of a thread sort of, looking like thingy, right? And if I go to the selection tool, as you can see, the one which is stabilized has less points than the one which is not stabilized. So if you want to create more accurate sort of, paths, I can create more or less of, something that looks like an accurate circle, when the stabilizer is actually open. It's more like having AI, work with you or something like that. So you can create a more stabilized sort of a shape, which is actually very nice. So sometimes I normally enable it. So you can increase the stabilized sort of radius, for example. Once the radius is something like at 0, let me make it at something like 9, right? It's going to be less stable, right? Once I put it back to like, higher figures, it's going to actually be more stable, and it's also going to increase that sort of a thread. So I recommend putting it to something like 120 or something like that, depending on what's actually comfortable with you. It will create, stable sort of paths, which is actually very nice. So I'm just going to remove this. And then there's this sort of a camera, tool, which is actually C. We shall go into it apparently. Once I click on it, nothing's basically going to happen, but we shall go into it once we start using cameras and 3D stuff, And then we have, the tracking tool. Once we click on it, it's going to show us that it's actually a Pro tool, which is actually a Pro tool, right? The tracking tool. We have a basic line, right? Once we click on it using out, it actually creates a basic line in here. There's another way of actually adding this. There's a shortcut, which is control period. Among the shapes, you can actually create a basic line right in here and it will just add it. Same thing with all the shapes and, most of the attributes and behaviors and utilities. You either press control period or you can just click on this plus and you can, add these. Yeah, that's another way of actually adding these sort of tools. Then we have a text layer. Basic line is basically more of a basic line, so you can just add any basic line and change some of the stylings in here to either Bezier sort of a thingy path, and it will create a Bezier path with those basic lines. The next one, we have a text. You can just click on it and just click anywhere and it will create a text, right? The text has its own attributes. We went through the attributes, so we shall be going through them. So apparently you can just double click and change the text to anything that you want. Same thing happens. There's a text string in here where you can still edit the text from, right? So yeah, you can put anything that you want and, you know, change the font. We shall be going through the sort of settings, right? But that's how you add a text. The next thing is this mesh tool. The shortcut is actually M. We shall be going through it. Apparently I won't go through it. It will be in some of those advanced sort of tutorials, how to use a mesh tool and stuff. This is what we've been using. So you can create a rectangle, you can create a circle or an ellipse, as we normally call it in the design world. You can create a polygon right here. I can actually just click anywhere. You can create a star. You know, once you have it enabled, you can click anywhere and it will create, you know, that kind of a shape. And this other sort of a shape, you know, which is actually very nice. You can create quite a lot of shapes. Now, as I finish on this, there are also some other sort of tools which are not included in this sort of interface, like a super shape, right? The super shape has multiple sort of attributes that you can actually randomize or just click in here to tweak. But the reason that's why it's called a super shape is that you can create multiple sort of shapes with it, you know, by just clicking this sort of randomizer or changing these sort of attributes in here, right? You can also change actually the shapes in here, right, to a ring. And just like I told you guys when I was talking about the attributes, that you can also change the primitives from there. These are more like primitives. Somebody has used maybe Cinema 4D or Blender, you know, they are literally referred to as primitives, although in the other sort of sense they are more of 3D, right? Yeah, that's it. You also go through some of these tools whenever you have time, but they're more or less the same as they are in here, right? You can create an arrow. It's also enabled in here. So yeah, that's basically it with the tools. I knew it was going to be a very long one. Yeah, but I hope you've learned something. In the next video, we shall go through the sort of color panel and I will show us how it works.